He was the fiercest Comanche war chief the plains had ever seen, shot twice, left to die beneath a sky that showed no mercy. The wind carried the smell of blood and dust, and the buzzards began to circle. But just as darkness swallowed the horizon, a faint sound broke through the silence, a child's footsteps. A little girl, alone, climbing the rocks toward the dying warrior. No one saw her. No one believed she could reach him. Yet that night, a small hand would defy death itself and alter the destiny of a nation. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The first light of dawn broke across the Llano like a knife of gold cutting through smoke. The Houma rode ahead of his warriors, his shadow long against the red earth, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. The canyon walls rose around them, silent, watchful, too still. The air carried no bird calls, no whisper of wind, only the muffled rhythm of hoofs on dry stone. His horse snorted uneasily. He raised a hand to halt the riders behind him, scanning the cliffs. Something in the stillness pressed on his chest, a memory of his father's warning, when the land holds its breath, so should you. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing on a glint of metal among the rocks. Then came the sound, sharp, metallic, final. A single gunshot split the air. The warrior beside him dropped without a sound, his horse bolting in terror. Another shot followed, and another, until the canyon exploded into chaos. The U.S. cavalry rose from their hiding spots like ghosts of the stone, rifles flashing in the new sun. The Houma shouted for his men to fall back, his voice swallowed by the thunder of gunfire. Dust rose in choking clouds. Horses screamed. The sound of bullets striking flesh echoed like thunder in the Valley of Gods. Tacoma's chest burned. A bullet had torn through a muscle near his shoulder, another grazing his ribs. He gritted his teeth, fired back once, twice, before his rifle was struck from his hands. A young Comanche tried to reach him, only to be thrown from his horse by a blast that sent blood spattering across the canyon wall. The Houma's vision blurred. He pulled his knife, spurred his horse toward the ridge, but the animal reared as another volley cracked through the air. He fell hard, dust filling his mouth, the sky spinning above him in a blur of blue and smoke. His ears rang. The cries of his warriors were fading, some scattered, others silent forever. The cavalry advanced methodically, their captain barking orders to check every fallen body. Tacoma dragged himself behind a boulder, breathing through grated teeth, tasting iron and sand. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling warmth spilling through his fingers. He tried to stand, but his leg gave out. A shadow fell over him, a soldier's silhouette outlined by firelight and dust. The man's rifle lowered slightly as he looked at the fallen chief. "He's done," the soldier muttered, spitting into the dirt before turning away. Tahoma's head fell back against the stone, his breath shallow. The sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance. Silence returned to the canyon, heavy and merciless. The smell of gunpowder lingered, mixing with the sweet rot of crushed sage. Buzzards circled above, patient and slow, black wings against a blood-red dawn. For the first time in years, Tacoma felt something close to peace, not in life, but in surrender. His people were gone, scattered like dust on the wind. The sky stretched wide and indifferent above him. He thought of his mother's songs, of his daughter's laughter long ago, of promises made to the land he fought to protect. The world dimmed at the edges, colors bleeding into shadow. Somewhere far off, the echo of drums throbbed in his mind, the heartbeat of the earth itself. His hand slipped from his chest to the ground. Dust covered his face like a burial cloth. By sunrise, the canyon had swallowed every sound, every cry, every echo of the living. Only the stillness remained. The stillness before the next breath of fate. The earth pressed cold against Tahoma's cheek, the taste of iron thick in his mouth, the hum of distant flies already beginning their slow feast among the fallen. His pulse was weak, thready, but stubborn, like the last ember refusing to die in the ashes of a long-dead fire. Around him, the canyon was littered with stillness, the kind that carried weight. A shattered lance leaned crooked beside him, its shaft darkened with blood, feathers from the warrior's headdress caught in the dry wind like ghosts rising toward the sun. He could not tell how long he had lain there, minutes, hours, but the light had shifted from the pale blue of dawn to the blistering gold of morning. The air stank of sweat, blood, and burn powder. Somewhere close, a horse neighed once, then fell silent forever. Through the blur of pain, the Homa thought he saw faces forming in the shimmering air. His father, his wife, his daughter, their features soft and distant, their eyes calm. He reached for them, fingers trembling, but they faded like smoke on the wind. "Your time is not yet," the wind seemed to whisper. The ground trembled faintly, a sound of boots crunching gravel. He froze. Cavalrymen. Their voices drifted closer, coarse and careless. "Make sure they're all finished. Don't need one of these devils crawling back to bite us." Another voice laughed, harsh and hollow. "Ain't no crawling out of that." The steps drew near, shadows moving across the dust. The Homa shut his eyes, slowed his breath until his chest barely moved. He listened to the soft metallic clicks of rifles, to the sound of a man muttering prayers under his breath. A hand grabbed his shoulder and rolled him slightly. Pain flashed white behind his eyes, but he didn't move. The soldier above him grunted. "Savages done." A spit hit the dirt beside his face, and the boots turned away. The sound of spurs jingled briefly, then faded into the distance. He waited, one heartbeat, then two. When the last echo of hoofbeats disappeared, Dahomey exhaled slowly, the breath trembling from his lungs like a secret escaping the grave. The sun climbed higher, punishing and unrelenting. His vision swam between clarity and oblivion. He tried to rise once but collapsed, his arms slick with blood. He lay still again, the earth beneath him turning warm and soft, and he thought of the river near his childhood home, the one his mother said carried the souls of warriors to the next world. He wondered if it was time to cross. His eyes drifted to the horizon where heat shimmered like spirit fire. A vulture swooped low, its shadow brushing across his face, the beat of its wings steady as the heart he no longer trusted to keep time. His breath grew shallow, yet somewhere deep in his chest, the ember still burned, faint but unwilling to die. He thought of his people, scattered, hunted, fading like the last tracks in the sand, and something inside him clenched. Not yet. He would not feed the earth today. He pressed his palm weakly to the wound at his side, forcing pressure, feeling warmth spill through his fingers. The pain was sharp, alive, a reminder of his unfinished war. The wind changed direction, carrying with it the faint scent of water, of life. Dacona turned his head, just enough to see the distant shimmer of the riverbed, dry for months but glinting now as though mocking him with a promise of salvation. He closed his eyes again, and in the darkness behind his lids, the faces of his ancestors lingered one last time, stern, silent, waiting. The world dimmed, and he slipped into the still gray place between life and death, unaware that the one who would find him was already on her way. Hours folded into one another like the edges of a worn blanket, and the canyon became a clock with teeth missing. Time moved, but its ticks were soft and uncertain. The wind, a thin, relentless mouth, sketched the scent of iron and old fires over the land, carrying with it the crushed whisper of sage, the dry grit of bone, the stale breath of men who had come and gone. Buzzards circled on slow, patient wings, turning the sky into a ledger where death was needed and accounted for, while beneath them the grass shivered and the coyotes' songs threaded the hills with a raw, hungry music that made Tahoma's name ache somewhere in his ribs. He lay half hidden against the bluff, the stone beneath him cooling as if the world were settling its accounts, and each shallow breath tasted of desert and regret. His wounds throbbed with a steady, animal insistence that kept time with the memory of hoofbeats and the snap of rifle fire. Between heartbeats his mind wandered like a horse let loose at dusk, stumbling across scenes that refused to belong in silence, fires that bloomed into nightmares, horses rearing with eyes full of panic, faces of warriors he had lost folding into one another until he could not tell the living from the gone. A child's cry rose and fell in those visions, sometimes his daughter's small, stubborn wail, sometimes the echo of a captive child from a raid long ago, and the sound cut him deeper than any bullet, opening something raw and unexpected inside his chest, longing, shame, a love that tasted of smoke. He reached for the memories as if they were a rope, fingers fumbling through the dark, but the rope slipped every time his hand closed. Images dissolved at the edges, leaving only the bone-bright truth of loss. The wind moved over him, and different, and with it came flashes of his mother's songs, low, droning things that had once steadied him as a boy beneath the open sky. Then the songs folded away under the thunder of his own blood. He tried to move, to shift his weight, to push himself up and force stubborn life into a leg that no longer obeyed. His muscles answered like a tired animal, with reluctance and a whisper of pain, and each attempt left him weaker, like a campfire that flares and then relents to ash. Darkness gathered at the edges of his vision, not the black of night but the soft gray that sits between waking and dreaming, and it tugged at him with the ease of a tide taking something small and familiar from the shore. In that twilight place he saw himself as the boy who first broke a mustang, chest swelling with the promise of being seen. He saw the faces of his people, stern, proud, carrying the weight of promises, and he felt the sharp, bitter ache of promises broken by the slow creep of settlers and the law of rifles. He thought of names, of the ones he could not save, and his throat closed with a sound like wind through a hollow reed. Yet beneath the ache, beneath the surrender, a thin ember glowed, so small he might have missed it had not the desert itself seemed to lean close and whisper, "Not yet." The whisper felt like a prod, a small, private command that salted his wounds with possibility. The sun dipped lower, and the canyon's angles softened. Shadows lengthened into quiet quarters. Somewhere far above, a vulture turned its head and watched. Below, and an unfinished life lay waiting. Unaware, unseen by the men who had ridden off, unseen by the birds that timed their circles, the land held its breath, and against the dry, inevitable pull of night, a faint, deliberate sound began to cross the ridge, the careful, uncertain footfall of a girl climbing toward a secret no one expected to keep. The morning stretched wide across the prairie, a pale and endless blue stitched with a hum of locusts and the sigh of tall grass. Annie knelt near a shallow spring, her hands stained green from the herbs she'd been gathering, feverweed, sweet sage, and wild mint, the kind her mother used to brew for coughs. The water shimmered in the light, bright enough to sting her eyes, but her gaze drifted beyond it, to the far ridge where the land broke open into rock and silence. A dark plume of smoke rose there, too heavy for a ranch fire, too lonely for the sky to claim as its own. She froze, her small body tightening with that instinct children feel before their minds can name danger. Her mother's voice returned to her, clear as if the woman stood right beside her. "Stay away from the ridges, Annie. That's Comanche land, the kind of land that remembers blood." Annie had never seen a Comanche up close, only the scars their name left in her father's stories, men on horses swift as storms, faces painted with war and grief, eyes that carried more sky than any settler could stand to meet. But now, watching that ribbon of smoke twist against the morning, she felt no fear. Not exactly. It was something quieter, stranger. A pull, deep as thirst, steady as the earth's hum beneath her feet. She rose slowly, clutching her pouch of herbs, and wiped her hands on her apron. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic scent she couldn't name. Burnt powder, blood, and dust mingled like old iron left in rain. Her heart stuttered. She turned toward home, toward the safety of her mother's low cabin hidden behind the cottonwoods, but her steps didn't follow. Instead, she found herself walking toward the ridge, her bare feet whispering through the dry grass, her breath catching on each gust of wind that seemed to beckon her forward. She told herself she only wanted to see what had burned, to understand the shape of that dark smoke against the sky. But as she walked, the world seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath around her. Grass turned to gravel beneath her soles. The spring's trickle faded into distance. Even the birds fell silent. The ridge loomed ahead, steep and jagged, the kind of place that kept secrets the way deserts kept bones. Annie hesitated at its base, her small hand brushing the stone's rough skin. Her pulse fluttered like a moth trapped between her ribs. Then the whisper came again, this time not her mother's warning, but something else, low and soft, carried on the wind. "Come." She blinked, looking around, half expecting to see someone there. No wind, only the endless stretch of rock and shadow. The sun tilted westward, painting the land in amber, and the smoke above the ridge began to thin, fading into a dim smear of gray. Annie tightened her grip on the herb pouch and started to climb. Her fingers sought holds between the rocks, her feet slipping on dust, her breath shallow but determined. She scraped her knees, tore her dress, but the climb didn't frighten her. It felt right, as if she'd always been meant to reach whatever waited above. The wind rose around her, singing through the stones, and for a heartbeat she thought she heard another sound layered beneath it, the faint, broken breath of something still alive. The ridge was steep, the world spinning below her, but she didn't stop. Each step drew her closer to the smell of smoke, the shimmer of heat, and the echo of something ancient and sorrowful calling her name in a voice she couldn't possibly have known. The light had turned the color of dying embers when Annie reached the top. The world spread out below her in bruised shades of orange and violet, the air thin and heavy with the scent of blood and dust. Her hands trembled as she steadied herself against a jagged stone, her breath catching at the sight before her. The land at the ridge's edge was scorched and still, marked by the violence that had passed. Broken spears, scattered cartridges, hoof prints pressed deep into the dirt as though the ground itself had flinched. She took one hesitant step, then another, the soles of her shoes crunching softly on the grit. Her eyes searched the silence, moving over the dark mounds that dotted the earth, shapes that could have been boulders or bodies. The air carried no sound but the dry hiss of wind through the grass. Then she saw him. Beneath a twisted mesquite tree, half buried in shadow, a figure lay sprawled on his back, motionless except for the faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. The world seemed to narrow to that single, fragile movement. Annie's heart leapt into her throat. Her first instinct was to run, to flee back down the ridge, back to the soft safety of her mother's cabin, but her feet stayed planted. Something in her refused to turn away. She inched closer, one small step at a time, her fingers clutching the pouch of herbs so tightly it left an imprint on her palm. The man's face came into view, hard and strong, yet softened by exhaustion, streaked with blood and dust that clung like paint. His skin was bronze beneath the dirt, his hair black as raven's wings, tangled with grass and blood. Even lying broken, he looked powerful, eternal, like the earth itself had taken the shape of a man. Annie's breath hitched. She remembered the stories whispered around the hearth, Comanche warriors who rode faster than wind, whose spirits never truly died. But this one was dying. The thought struck her like a blade. His lips were cracked, his chest moved in shallow, trembling breaths, and the dirt beneath him was dark with the blood he'd lost. "He's still alive," she whispered, her voice trembling, the words barely leaving her mouth. Saying it made it real, made her see how near he was to the edge of life. The world around her shifted, the air thicker, charged with something sacred and wrong all at once. She knelt beside him, careful not to touch, her eyes wide as she studied his face. A small scar crossed his cheek, another near his collarbone, the marks of a man who had known too many battles. For a long moment she simply stared, frozen between awe and terror. She could hear her mother's warning again, sharp in her mind. "They are not like us, Annie. You stay away from them." But this didn't look like the monster her mother had described. This was a man broken, bleeding, breathing because something, maybe fate, maybe stubbornness, had refused to let him die. A faint groan escaped his throat, so soft she thought at first it was the wind shifting through the tree. His hand twitched. Annie gasped, stumbling back, her heels striking a loose stone. The noise startled a vulture from the tree above, its wings sweeping low as it fled into the open air, the rush of feathers loud and alive. Annie pressed a hand over her mouth, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the warrior's face. He did not move again, but the moment felt changed, alive with invisible weight. The sky deepened to purple, the last light slipping behind the ridge. Annie stood there in the fading glow, a child on sacred ground, caught between fear and wonder, between her mother's warnings and the pulse of something ancient calling her forward. She looked down at him one more time, swallowed hard, and whispered to the dark, "I won't leave you." The canyon seemed to breathe in response. If you've ridden this far with us, tip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The sky had deepened into a bruised indigo, and the first trembling stars began to burn above the canyon as Annie crouched beside the fallen warrior, her small frame casting a narrow shadow across his battered chest. The air was thick and motionless, the kind of silence that feels alive, humming just beyond the reach of sound. Her hands shook as she unfastened the cork from her flask. The cool metal slipped with sweat and dirt. She hesitated only a moment before tilting it, letting a thin stream of water slide down the curve of his cracked lips. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, as if the desert itself exhaled, his throat moved, a faint swallow, a tremor that rippled through the stillness. His eyes flickered open, dark, fever-bright, rimmed with pain. Annie gasped and nearly dropped the flask, startled by the weight of his gaze. It wasn't anger in those eyes, not at first, just confusion, the hazy recognition of life where he'd expected only death. He tried to speak, the words scraping out like gravel. Go. His voice cracked, dry and broken, the syllable heavy with warning. Danger. She understood enough to know he meant for her to leave. Her heart pounded in her chest so hard it hurt, but she shook her head, the motion small yet certain. You're hurt, she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. He blinked, as if the meaning took a moment to find him, and something unreadable passed across his face, something between disbelief and sorrow. Annie fumbled in her pouch, pulling out the bundle of herbs she'd gathered earlier that day, their green leaves now half crushed and wilted. Her mother had taught her which plants soothed burns, which slowed bleeding. She tore a strip from her skirt, wet it with the last of the water, and pressed the cloth gently against his shoulder wound. He flinched but didn't pull away. The sound that escaped him was low, animal, but behind it there was something human, a thread of endurance, of pride refusing to break. Easy, she whispered, her brow furrowed in concentration, mimicking the tone her mother used when binding her father's hand after a plow accident. He stared at her, lips parting as if to protest, but the strength to form words had already drained from him. Instead, he closed his eyes, surrendering for a moment to her touch, the rhythm of her small, deliberate movements. Annie's mind raced with everything she'd been told. The Comanche were killers, wild and merciless. Yet this man's chest rose shallow and uncertain beneath her hands, his body trembling with each breath like something too fragile for such a harsh world. He didn't feel like danger. He felt like a dying man no one else would save. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, watching him carefully. His breathing steadied just enough for hope to flicker. Then his hand moved, a slow, deliberate motion, and he gripped her wrist, not hard, just enough to hold her attention. His eyes opened again, dark and fierce, his voice low as dust. Why? The word came rough, almost like a growl. Annie's throat tightened. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't have the words for the strange pull she'd felt since the smoke first rose beyond the hills. Because you were left behind, she said finally. For a long time, he said nothing, his gaze searching hers as if looking for deceit. But there was only innocence there, raw, defiant, unafraid. Something in his face softened, a shadow of respect, or perhaps disbelief that such a creature of gentleness existed still in this blood-soaked land. Above them, the vulture's cry faded into the stars. Annie stayed kneeling, her tiny hand resting near his. Somewhere in the canyon's dark heart, a wind stirred, soft at first, then stronger, carrying with it the quiet truth that neither of them would ever be the same again. Night fell over the canyon like a great animal spreading its dark hide across the land, swallowing every color until only the faint orange whisper of a child's fire dared to challenge it. The air had cooled sharply, and the scent of dust and sage thickened with the metallic tang of blood. Annie crouched low beside the dying warrior, her tiny hands trembling as she coaxed sparks from a scrap of flint she'd stolen from her father's workshop. The brush caught slowly, reluctantly, until a fragile flame bloomed in the hollow of her cupped palms. She built it small, just enough to warm his skin, not enough to draw unwanted eyes. The shadows of the mesquite branches twisted above them, black claws against the sky. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes began to sing, their howls rising and falling like a mournful choir, each note closer than the last. Annie pressed closer to Tacoma, shielding the weak fire with her body, her breath uneven but steady. She could feel the man's heat radiating off him, fever hot and trembling, his breaths jagged like the wind scraping across broken glass. His eyes were half closed, lashes glinting with sweat, his lips moving silently, words in a language she couldn't understand. She thought maybe he was praying, and the thought made her chest tighten. Her mother always said prayers could travel through any tongue if the heart behind them was true. So Annie began to hum, softly at first, barely louder than the whisper of the flame. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing when thunder rolled across the plains, a simple tune about rivers finding their way home. Her voice cracked once, but she kept going, her gaze fixed on the tiny flicker of fire that made the world around them just barely visible, the curve of his arm, the beads at his wrist, the pale gleam of her own frightened eyes. In his fevered mind, Dahomey drifted between worlds. The song reached him like an echo from far away, threading through the pain that clotted his body. For a moment, he wasn't lying broken in the dirt, but standing in the soft light of another campfire, a smaller hand reaching for his, a child's laugh bright as morning. His daughter, bright eyes, hair the color of the canyon sand, gone too soon. He saw her face as clearly as he once had, but when she opened her mouth, the sound that came was Annie's trembling song, soft and human, carrying both sorrow and forgiveness in its small, wavering melody. His throat constricted. The ghosts of his past crowded close, the raid that took his child, the vengeance that followed, the men he'd killed trying to bury grief beneath duty. Yet here, in this quiet hollow of night, the voice of a foreign child broke through all that noise, threading peace through the chaos like water finding cracks in stone. His body shook, a single tear tracing the line of his cheek, catching dust as it fell. Annie didn't see it, too focused on keeping the fire alive. She added another twig, careful, patient, like tending a sleeping heart. When the wind gusted, she hunched over it protectively, whispering the melody between breaths. "Sleep, little one. The stars will keep you safe," she murmured, half to him, half to herself. The coyotes' cries faded slowly, replaced by the endless hum of desert night. The stars above burned brighter now, cold and infinite. Annie looked up once, her face painted with the faint glow of the fire, and thought of her mother, wondering if she'd ever understand why she had climbed this far to save a stranger. Beside her, Dahome's breathing steadied. He would not die tonight. The desert had taken many things from both of them, but under the blanket of stars and the song of a lonely girl, it gave back one small mercy, the promise of another dawn. Night fell over the canyon like a great animal spreading its dark hide across the land, swallowing every color until only the faint orange whisper of a child's fire dared to challenge it. The air had cooled sharply, and the scent of dust and sage thickened with the metallic tang of blood. Annie crouched low beside the dying warrior, her tiny hands trembling as she coaxed sparks from a scrap of flint she'd stolen from her father's workshop. The brush caught slowly, reluctantly, until a fragile flame bloomed in the hollow of her cupped palms. She built it small, just enough to warm his skin, not enough to draw unwanted eyes. The shadows of the mesquite branches twisted above them, black claws against the sky. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes began to sing, their howls rising and falling like a mournful choir, each note closer than the last. Annie pressed closer to Dahomey, shielding the weak fire with her body, her breath uneven but steady. She could feel the man's heat radiating off him, fever hot and trembling, his breaths jagged like the wind scraping across broken glass. His eyes were half closed, lashes glinting with sweat, his lips moving silently, words in a language she couldn't understand. She thought maybe he was praying, and the thought made her chest tighten. Her mother always said prayers could travel through any tongue if the heart behind them was true. So Annie began to hum, softly at first, barely louder than the whisper of the flame. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing when thunder rolled across the plains, a simple tune about rivers finding their way home. Her voice cracked once, but she kept going, her gaze fixed on the tiny flicker of fire that made the world around them just barely visible, the curve of his arm, the beads at his wrist, the pale gleam of her own frightened eyes. In his fevered mind, Dahomey drifted between worlds. The song reached him like an echo from far away, threading through the pain that clawed at his body. For a moment, he wasn't lying broken in the dirt, but standing in the soft light of another campfire, a smaller hand reaching for his, a child's laugh bright as morning. His daughter, bright eyes, hair the color of the canyon sand, gone too soon. He saw her face as clearly as he once had, but when she opened her mouth, the sound that came was Annie's trembling song, soft and human, carrying both sorrow and forgiveness in its small, wavering melody. His throat constricted. The ghosts of his past crowded close, the raid that took his child, the vengeance that followed, the men he'd killed trying to bury grief beneath duty. Yet here, in this quiet hollow of night, the voice of a foreign child broke through all that noise, threading peace through the chaos like water finding cracks in stone. His body shook, a single tear tracing the line of his cheek, catching dust as it fell. Annie didn't see it, too focused on keeping the fire alive. She added another twig, careful, patient, like tending a sleeping heart. When the wind gusted, she hunched over it protectively, whispering the melody between breaths. "Sleep, little one. The stars will keep you safe," she murmured, half to him, half to herself. The coyote's cries faded slowly, replaced by the endless hum of desert night. The stars above burned brighter now, cold and infinite. Annie looked up once, her face painted with the faint glow of the fire, and thought of her mother, wondering if she'd ever understand why she had climbed this far to save a stranger. Beside her, Tahomi's breathing steadied. He would not die tonight. The desert had taken many things from both of them, but under the blanket of stars and the song of a lonely girl, it gave back one small mercy, the promise of another dawn. The night grew heavy and deep, pressing its cold weight upon the canyon like a shroud, and Tahoma's mind, adrift between fever and shadow, slipped its tether from the broken body lying beneath the mesquite tree. In the dark corridors of his mind, memory came not as comfort but as fire. He saw again the first horse he ever broke, a wild mustang the color of dusk, its spirit as fierce as his own had once been. He had been only 12, small but unyielding, his father watching from the ridge, saying nothing, trusting the land to teach its lesson. The boy he had been clung to the animal's back until both beast and child bled from the fight, and when the mustang finally stilled beneath him, Tom learned the truth of power. It was not taken by force, but earned by endurance. The memory shifted, melting into another, his first hunt, his first victory, the thrill of returning to camp with the others chanting his name. Then the images darkened, the first battle, the white soldiers charging across the plains like a swarm of locusts, their rifles spitting fire. He remembered the smell of black powder, the cries of his people, the blood that turned the grass to mud. Faces flashed in the fever's red light, his brothers, proud and laughing the day before he died, his daughters, her hair whipping across her face as she ran toward him before the raid that took her from this world. The fever twisted everything together until past and present blurred, and he saw the white settlers' faces again, men and women and children, their fear no different from the fear in his own people's eyes. Hatred, he realized, had always been the same color, no matter which tongue spoke it. The wind moved across his face, cold and real, pulling him closer to waking. His throat burned. The faint sound of breathing reached him, not his own, but small, steady, close. His eyes opened slowly, the stars swimming above him like slow-moving spirits. For a heartbeat, he forgot where he was, and then he saw her, the little girl, curled beside him, her head resting on her arm, her small body drawn tight against the chill. Her hair caught the starlight like strands of gold, and her hand, so small, so impossibly fragile, rested lightly on his forearm. He froze, afraid to move, afraid that even the rise of his chest might wake her. The warmth from her hand sank into his skin, cutting through the fever, through the cold that had lived in him since the day his daughter's laughter vanished into smoke. He stared at her, this pale creature of the other world, this child who had crossed the boundary of fear to sit beside death and offer water to an enemy. He did not understand her courage, but he felt its power. It was as if some spirit had sent her, not to heal his body, but to remind him of something he had buried long ago, that compassion could live in a land scorched by hate, that innocence still had a voice. A lump rose in his throat, and before he could stop it, a single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, disappearing into the dust between them. The fire had burned down to embers, their faint glow reflecting in his gaze. The fever had loosened its hold, and in its place came something softer, a quiet, aching awareness that he was not yet gone, that the world had chosen, somehow, to leave him one small reason to stay. Annie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he could not understand, and her fingers twitched against his skin as if to remind him he was not alone. For the first time in years, Dahoma closed his eyes not in surrender, but in peace, letting the rhythm of her breathing carry him through the darkness like a song. Dawn crept slowly into the canyon, cautious and fragile, as if unsure the world below deserved its light after all the blood it had swallowed. The first rays of sun spilled like melted gold across the stone, catching the smoke from the dying fire and painting it into ribbons that danced above the earth. Annie startled, blinking sleep from her eyes, her face pale but calm in the cool glow of morning. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that the air smelled of sage and something heavy, something human. Then her gaze fell to the figure beside her, the wounded Comanche warrior, still breathing, still alive, and the memories of the night returned in a rush. The fear, the song, the warmth of the fire between them. His chest rose shallowly beneath the makeshift bandage she had tied before dawn. His skin gleamed with sweat, his dark hair tangled across his brow, and his eyes, when they opened, were sharp again, though the pain in him had not lessened. He looked at her in silence, the lines of his face unreadable, his breath slow and deliberate as if each inhale cost him something precious. Annie moved carefully, reaching for her pouch. She crushed fresh sage between her small fingers, mixing it with water from her flask until it made a green paste. The smell filled the air, sharp and clean. She peeled back the blood-soaked cloth and dabbed the mixture onto the wound, wincing as he flinched beneath her touch. "It'll help," she murmured, more to herself than to him. He didn't stop her. He only watched, his dark eyes tracking every motion, studying her like she was something he couldn't name, part child, part spirit. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The silence between them stretched, long and full of things neither knew how to say. Finally, his voice broke it, low and rough like a river scraping over stone. "Why?" The single word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, carrying more weight than its sound. Annie looked up, unsure what he meant. "Why?" "Help me?" he managed, each syllable thick with exhaustion, with disbelief. His gaze didn't waver, and for the first time she saw the full depth of it. Loneliness, suspicion, pride, and beneath it all, something softer he was too proud to name. She bit her lip, thinking. The wind stirred the dust around them, and somewhere far below, a hawk cried, the sound stretching thin across the canyon. Annie's eyes found his again, clear and steady despite the fear that still fluttered behind them. "Because you were left behind," she said simply. Her voice didn't tremble. The words fell quiet, but they hit something deep inside him, something he'd thought had died years ago. He turned his head away, jaw tight, and for a long time said nothing. Those words, so small, so innocent, cut through layers of silence and memory, slicing open the ghosts that lived inside him. Left behind. His people, scattered and broken. His daughter, taken. His pride, lost beneath the boots of soldiers who spoke mercy while carrying fire. The cannon seemed to close around them, pressing the truth deeper into his chest. And he looked down, unsure if she had said something wrong, but the warrior only closed his eyes, the shadow of pain in his face softening into something else, recognition. "The world leaves many," he said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper, like he was confessing to the earth itself. Annie didn't answer. She reached for his water flask, lifted it carefully to his lips, and he drank, slow and deliberate, as the first warmth of morning touched his skin. For the first time, the sun didn't feel like judgment, it felt like forgiveness, shy and fleeting but real enough to keep him tethered to the living. When Annie looked at him again, the gold light caught in his eyes, and for a moment, the silence between them felt less like a distance, and more like a bridge. If you've ridden this far with us, dip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The calm of morning shattered under the distant thunder of hooves, a low, rhythmic drum that rolled across the canyon floor and sent a shiver through the stones themselves. Annie froze mid-motion, the cup of water in her hand trembling as the sound grew louder, closer. Tahoma's head turned sharply toward the noise, his instincts flaring awake faster than his body could follow. His pulse quickened, eyes narrowing into that sharp, commanding focus that belonged to a leader, not a dying man. "Soldiers," he rasped, the words scraping through cracked lips. Annie looked toward the canyon's edge, and sure enough, faint plumes of dust were rising in the distance, catching the sunlight like thin smoke. The ground beneath them trembled again, steady and merciless. Panic flared in her chest, wild and hot. "We have to hide," she whispered. Tahoma tried to push himself upright, his arms trembling under his weight. The muscles in his wounded side clenched, and the pain made him gasp, his strength faltering before he could stand. Annie was already at his side, her small hands braced under his shoulder, her face tight with determination that didn't fit her size. "Come on," she urged, her voice breaking with effort as she tried to lift him. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to move, dragging one leg as the other refused to obey. The world tilted around him, shadows spinning, blood roaring in his ears. Together they half crawled, half stumbled toward a jagged boulder nearby, its base hollowed out just enough to offer shade and a prayer of concealment. Annie's heart pounded so hard she thought it might give them away before the soldiers even arrived. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew clearer, now distinct, individual, the familiar metallic rhythm of cavalry horses descending into the pass. She could hear the muffled voices of men, the jangle of bridles and canteens. She pushed Tahoma behind the rock, his breathing ragged, then crouched beside him, clutching her herb pouch tight against her chest. "Stay still," she whispered, though he had already gone motionless, his gaze fixed beyond the canyon's edge. The horses slowed, their steps crunching softly over the gravel. The sound was unbearably close now. Annie dared to peek over the rock's edge. 5 riders came into view, their blue coats dusty from the trail, rifles slung loosely at their sides. They dismounted, spreading out with practiced precision, their boots stirring the dirt. The one in front, a tall man with a scar slicing down his cheek, walked to the very spot where Tahoma had lain the night before. He knelt, his gloved fingers brushing against the blood-stained earth. "Wasn't this where we left that one?" he muttered. Another soldier spat into the dust. "Yeah, the chief. Guess the coyotes got him." The scarred man frowned, scanning the ground. His gaze caught on something a few feet away, a faint imprint in the dirt, small and narrow. A footprint. "Hold up," he said sharply, crouching lower. "A girl's been here." Annie's breath caught in her throat. Her body went rigid, every muscle screaming for silence. The men exchanged wary glances. "Girl?" one repeated, half laughing, half uneasy. "Ain't no girl climbing this ridge." "You think?" "I think somebody helped him," the scarred man interrupted, his tone flat but edged with suspicion. He stood, scanning the rocks with narrowed eyes, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Annie pressed her face into the dirt, hard hammering against the stone. The faint scent of sage filled her nose, grounding her in the terror of the moment. Tahoma, half hidden in the shadow beside her, reached out weakly, his hand brushing her arm in a silent command, "Do not move." The soldiers lingered, their voices carrying low across the canyon. Then, after what felt like hours, the scarred man sighed and waved a dismissive hand. "Tracks lead nowhere. Let's ride." "Sun's rising too hot for ghost hunting." The men mounted up, the sound of rain snapping sharp against the air. Hoofs thundered once more, fading into the distance. Only when the last echo died did Danny lift her head, eyes wide and wet, her body shaking with the effort of not breaking. She looked to Tahoma. His eyes were open, calm but fierce, the eyes of a man who had walked with death before. For the first time, she saw gratitude there, silent, unspoken, but unmistakable. The wind shifted, and for a moment, the world exhaled again. The canyon returning to its ancient stillness. The sound of the soldiers' boots grinding against stone filled the canyon like a slow, inevitable drumbeat, drawing closer with every breath Annie dared not take. Dust swirled around their legs as they dismounted, their spurs clicking in rhythm with the nervous snorts of their horses. From her place behind the boulder, Annie could see the glint of sunlight on their brass buttons, could hear the creak of leather and the occasional curse muttered between teeth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, wild and loud, and she was certain they could hear it. The homo lay beside her, still as carved stone, his breathing shallow, his blood dark and drying in the heat. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to flee down the ridge before they spotted her, but she forced herself to stay, clutching her shawl tight against her chest. When one of the soldiers began walking their way, his boots crunching over loose gravel, panic clawed up her throat. Without thinking, she moved. Annie reached down and pulled her shawl from her shoulders, its faded floral pattern fluttering in the wind like a small, defiant flag. She draped it over Tihoma's face, hiding the sharp lines of his features beneath its folds, then stood up on trembling legs. Her fingers went to her herb pouch, and she dropped to her knees beside a patch of scraggly desert flowers growing through the cracks in the stone. Her hands fumbled, plucking at stems that weren't even blooming, pretending focus she didn't feel. The soldier's shadow fell across her before his voice did. "Hey, you there? What are you doing up here?" Annie's head jerked up, her eyes wide but steady. "Picking flowers," she said, her voice small but clear, the lie falling easily from the mouth of a child too young to know its danger. The man frowned, clearly baffled. "Flowers?" he repeated, his eyes narrowing as they flicked to the shroud-draped shape beside her. "You alone?" Annie nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. My mama says they keep away bad dreams." I was going to surprise her. The soldier stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Behind him, another man laughed, the sound sharp and dry. "Ain't no flowers up here worth plucking, kid. You lost or just dumb." The first soldier, older, with the worn look of someone who'd seen too many strange things in this desert, held up a hand. "Leave it. She's just a settler brat." He squinted at the horizon, shading his eyes against the glare of the sun. "No one's fool enough to climb up here anyway." His tone carried finality, and Annie nearly collapsed with the weight of relief it brought. But she kept still, lowering her gaze again. Plucking another useless stem, her fingers shaking so hard she nearly tore it from the root. The men turned away, muttering as they went. One lingered a moment longer, glancing back at her, suspicion flickering across his face before he shrugged and mounted his horse. "Let's ride," the sergeant called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The horses obeyed, hooves striking the ground in a syncopated rhythm that faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind. Only when the last echo died did Annie let herself breathe. Her lungs burned, her hands numb. Slowly, she turned back to the boulder and pulled the shawl away. The homa's eyes met hers, dark, alive, and filled with something she didn't recognize at first: pride. "Brave," he whispered, the word rasping through his throat like sand. Annie tried to smile but failed, her eyes filling with tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The wind moved softly around them, whispering through the canyon like a sigh of the earth itself. The danger had passed, but the silence that followed was heavier than before, a silence that belonged to two souls who had just cheated death and knew it was still watching. For a long time after the soldiers' hoofbeats faded into the horizon, the canyon lay in breathless silence, the kind that follows the nearness of death, where even the wind dares not speak. Annie knelt beside Tehoma once more, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the shawl still half covering him, her face streaked with dust and sweat. The man stirred, his breath ragged, the lines of pain around his mouth easing only slightly as he opened his eyes. The sunlight had shifted now, bright and sharp, gilding the stone around them like the edges of a living flame. For a moment, neither spoke. There were no words big enough to fill the space between them, not in his tongue nor hers. Then, slowly, Tehoma's gaze found her face, and what he saw there, this small creature with dirt on her cheeks and courage in her eyes, stirred something deep in him, something that no blade or bullet had ever touched. "You," he whispered, voice hoarse as gravel. "Spirit of mountain." The words rasped through the air, thick with reverence, as if naming her risked breaking the fragile magic that held them both alive. Annie blinked, startled, not sure what he meant but feeling the truth of it in the way his eyes softened, the way his voice carried both wonder and gratitude. She smiled then, a small, tired thing, but pure. "You have to go home," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the same tone she might have used with a wounded bird refusing to fly. She reached down, sliding an arm beneath his shoulder, her slight frame shaking with the effort to help him sit upright. The Homa grunted, pain flashing across his face, but he did not resist. He used the rock to steady himself, the world tilting and blurring at the edges. Her hand, so small against his arm, felt impossibly steady. He studied her then, the fear she had swallowed, the defiance in her spine, the strange calm that clung to her like the scent of sage. She was not of his people, not of his world, yet somehow, in her eyes, he saw a reflection of the same fire that had once driven his own daughter to stand before him when he taught her not to fear thunder. He closed his eyes, swallowed hard, and nodded. "So do you," he said quietly, each word deliberate, shaped like a promise. She didn't answer, but her expression shifted, something fierce passing through it, something far older than her years. The wind moved then, swirling dust around them in soft spirals, carrying the scent of wild grass and smoke, the ghost of the night's fire. In that moment, the world seemed suspended, two souls from opposite sides of a fractured land, bound by the same pulse of survival, the same ancient understanding that life and mercy were things the earth respected above blood and vengeance. Annie reached for his hand, helping him rise. The movement was slow, painful, but sure. When he finally stood, leaning against the rock for balance, she stepped back, her eyes searching his face as though to memorize it, the proud curve of his jaw, the weariness in his posture, the shadow of pride still clinging to him even now. "You're not meant to die here," she said softly, more to herself than to him. He looked down at her, the corner of his mouth lifting, not a smile exactly, but something close, something that spoke of gratitude without surrender. "No," he murmured, glancing toward the horizon where the plains stretched endless and red. "Not today." Their eyes met one last time, the silence between them alive with everything they couldn't say. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the seed of it, buried here, between a child who broke every rule to save an enemy, and a man who had forgotten the taste of mercy until she gave it back to him. The dust rose around them, swirling like a veil, sealing the moment in the quiet eternity of the desert. The dawn rose slow and solemn, bleeding gold across the broken ridges as the desert shed its night like an old skin, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, the canyon exhaled peace instead of grief. Annie stood beside Tahoma as the last fingers of shadow slipped away from the stone, the air around them cool and trembling with light. He had found a stick from the charred remains of a spear to lean upon, his arm still weak, his movements unsteady but full of stubborn life. The wound at his side throbbed with each breath, but he no longer felt the drag of death clinging to his bones. Instead, he felt the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the steady, ancient heartbeat of a land that refused to forget its own stories. Annie walked beside him, her small hand hovering near his arm, ready to catch him if he faltered, though she knew she was too small to stop a man like him from falling. Still, she stayed close, her steps sure and patient, her gaze fixed forward. The silence between them was not empty, it was sacred, heavy with all the words neither of them could speak. The land stretched endless and red before them, its horizon blurred in a rising veil of heat. Every step they took stirred a small cloud of dust that glowed like sparks in the morning light. The desert, once a graveyard of violence, now felt like a temple. There was reverence in the stillness, the kind born when two survivors walked the same road for different reasons yet carried the same ache in their hearts. Tacoma's voice broke that silence once, low and rough, more breath than sound. "The sun returns," he said in his own tongue, his gaze fixed on the widening blaze of light ahead. Annie didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the weary hope in it, the quiet awe. "It does," she said softly, answering him in English, as if the sky itself could hear them both. They reached the ridge just as the sun crested fully, spilling light so bright it made them both squint. From here, the world spread out before them in waves of red and gold, dust, rock, horizon, infinity. The air shimmered, alive with promise and memory. Annie turned to him, the wind tugging at her hair. "You have to go home," she said gently, her voice steady despite the ache rising in her throat. Tahoma turned his gaze toward the distant plains, the land of his people, somewhere beyond the rolling heat. "So do you," he replied, and his words carried both command and blessing. Their eyes met, and in that moment something ancient passed between them. Something older than language, older than the line drawn between tribes and settlers. It was understanding, pure, simple, unspoken. She reached out and brushed the dust from his arm, her fingers light against his skin, and then stepped back. He nodded once, slow and solemn, the gesture heavy with gratitude. No words followed. They didn't need any. Tahoma adjusted the stick beneath his hand and began walking toward the horizon, his figure growing smaller with each step, swallowed slowly by the red haze that rose from the earth. Annie stood where she was, watching until the desert turned him into the shadow, and the shadow into memory. The wind carried the faint rattle of his bracelets, a sound that lingered long after he was gone. She felt it settle somewhere deep inside her, a promise written in dust and blood and sunlight, that she would never forget this morning, or the man who walked away into the fire of dawn. When the wind finally died, Annie turned back toward her own home, the first tears of parting drying warm on her cheeks, her footprints side by side with his until they disappeared into the light. Years blurred into years like hoofprints washing away under rain, and the canyon that once held a night of terror learned to keep its secret in 1,000 different tongues. Settlers who passed the ridge told it one way, sharp, tidy, and small, because stories must comfort the living. They spoke of a Comanche chief who should have died but didn't, rescued, so the tale went, by a pale angel child who climbed where no child should climb, a holy thing that made guilt lighter and danger simpler. They carved the story into fences and barroom talk until it fit the shape of what they wanted to believe. The tribes carried it other ways, weightier and older, told around winter fires with the slow cadence of prayer. A warrior whose spirit hung between worlds was found by a girl who sang the songs of 2 sons, who carried water and herbs and the stubborn mercy of children. In the telling, she was not an angel but kin to the canyon, part wind, part sagebrush, part human courage, someone who crossed the ragged line between blood and law and, in doing so, returned a breath to a dying man and a reason to the living. Both versions wrapped themselves around the ridge like smoke, one warm and soft, the other salty and honest, and both were true in their way because truth is a many-legged thing that walks on whatever ground it's given. Mothers used the story to teach. Settler mothers warned daughters against climbing into other people's wars. Comanche grandmothers said the tale to keep memory sharp, to remind children a warrior's life is never only his own. Miners, cowboys, school teachers, and medicine men repeated the line about the little girl who climbed. Over the years, it swelled into a legend that fit the mouths of men who needed something to answer the emptiness left by violence. Yet the heart of it, the single small hand that would not turn away from a wound, remained stubborn and unadorned in every retelling, the quiet kernel that refused to be polished. People built meanings from it like they build cairns. Some stacked words to praise bravery, others stacked words to justify fear. Tribes told the story at potlatches, their voices low, and there the girl was not merely brave. She was a bridge, a living proof that mercy could cross a border no treaty could line. Settlers passed the tale on tavern lips. The girl blurred into the angel child, the warrior into a myth who later led raids no man could remember clearly. Yet the moment when a child poured water on a stranger's lips was always the hinge. And so the ridge kept both voices, the white man's tidy miracle and the tribe's patient parable. Like twin echoes waiting for the right ear, time softened edges, scars became ornaments, sorrow braided into legend, and where anger once ruled the valley, a different thing grew, a rumor of possible reconciliation, small as a sprout in stone. Historians would later mark the event with dates and footnotes, but the real history lived in the mouths of those who told it beside fires, who taught their children what it means to notice a person left behind. The canyon's wind carried both versions, and sometimes at dusk, when the light bends and the land seems to contemplate its own past, you can still hear them braided together, the cry of a vulture, the lullaby of a settler mother, the distant thunder of hooves, the tiny, fierce voice of a child refusing to leave. It became more than a rescue. It became an argument the land itself offered, that small acts can tilt the course of nations, that one breath return can change how two peoples remember each other. In the end, whether you choose the settler's angel or the tribe's spirit girl, the ridge asks the same question in a voice older than both. What will you do when you find someone left behind? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.